So next up is our second and final panel of today. It's called Clashing Crises, the State of America's Direct Support Professional Workforce and the Case for Inclusion. The Case for Inclusion, incidentally, is also the name of a report that is put out by United Cerebral Palsy and ANCOR. I want to thank you all for tuning in for this event. And I also want to mention that if you want to find out more about us, of course, go to ucp.org and you can learn about us and our affiliates. There's a place to click to find out where there's an affiliate near you and how to reach them, and more importantly, how to donate to them. So please go to our website for that information. And then you can also find information about tomorrow's events for the conference, full schedule there as well. Now, here to moderate this very important discussion is Shane Kanady, the Vice President of Workforce Development at Source America.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this important session. So I am pleased to be here to moderate and join all of our esteemed panelists and look forward to a very engaging conversation and learning a lot myself through the course of the next 50 or so minutes. So as James shared, I am the Vice President of Workforce Development for Source America. We are a central nonprofit agency that supports the employment of persons with disabilities throughout the United States. And I am also a fellow for the senior fellow for the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, which is also known as G3ICT, which is an international organization supporting the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I've worked within the disability community for over 20 years with a primary focus on inclusive employment. In terms of introduction, I am also a 41-year-old white male with short black and gray hair and a black beard. I am referred to by he, him pronouns. I'm also wearing a white shirt with blue stripes and a blue sport coat. My background is my home office, which includes my modest and dusty collection of guitars. So in terms of our panel discussion today, it will feature unique perspectives on a significant structural problem impacting the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the US labor market, the strength of the direct support professional workforce. So direct support professionals, or DSPs, are critical to the aspirational goals of full economic and societal inclusion expressed throughout the disability community. Importantly, we must recognize how DSPs not only support the individual decisions made by persons with disabilities in a local context, but they also contribute to achieving goals set forth in public administration, such as increased representation in government and private sector employment. There was already a great concern about declining numbers of DSPs in the workforce leading into the COVID-19 pandemic. And this issue and the resulting impact on provider organizations throughout the US, persons with disabilities, and communities only became more obvious and alarming during the ebbs and flows of the global health crisis and the economic disruptions that were tied into that. Today, our discussants will share their perspectives on this topic and offer recommendations for steps to address the state of the DSP workforce through this period of recovery and beyond. This discussion complements and contextualizes the important research conducted by UCP and ANCOR in their 2022 report that James shared, the Case for Inclusion. So with that, I'd like to start by introducing our first panelist, and that would be Lydia Brown. Lydia is a Director of Policy, Regulatory, and Legal Analysis at ANCOR. She formerly served as the Executive Director for the Maine Association for Community Service Providers and the Idaho Association of Community Providers, representing agencies supporting individuals with behavioral health and developmental disabilities. She also served as the primary researcher and author of UCP and ANCOR's The Case for Inclusion 2022, Blazing Trails for Sustainability to Community Disability Services. Lydia, will you please provide your opening comments?
Hi, my name is Lydia Dawson. I'm the Director of Policy, Regulatory, and Legal Analysis with ANCOR. I'm a white woman with red hair and freckles, and my background is a branded ANCOR background in blues and oranges. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quick so I can share a PowerPoint with you. The PowerPoint is largely just text on a branded background for ANCOR, and I will be happy to share the context of the text that's available. So I understand you had an opportunity to hear a little bit about the Case for Inclusion 2022, Blazing Trails to Sustainability for Community Disability Services. This we co-authored with UCP, and you can find all of the information that's available as well as the report at caseforinclusion.org. The Case for Inclusion is informed by data polls of what's the most recently available national data on the points that we track, and you can find a breakout of each of those points as well as more and a state-specific breakout of each of those data points that's highlighted in the report. But what I want to use this time for, I know I have just a brief time, is to highlight some of the takeaways from the report and a little bit of coming into it, how we view the direct support workforce crisis. So prior to authoring the report, we at ANCOR did a direct support workforce crisis survey. We did one pre-pandemic and also one in August 2021, which gave us a sense of how those numbers changed throughout the pandemic. So these are the takeaway points that we had from our 2021 survey, but I'll highlight just one point of a dramatic increase that we saw. So due to the direct support workforce crisis, we saw that 77% of community providers are turning away new referrals. 58% of community providers are discontinuing programs and services. This is the data point that I hope to highlight the most because this represented a 70.6% increase on the same data metric from before the pandemic began. So we surveyed people in February of 2020, and then this is our August 2021 poll. So there was the most dramatic increase we saw was providers discontinuing programs and services due to a lack of workforce. So more than half of all of our respondents said that they had discontinued programs and services because they didn't have the staff to be able to continue the service. 84% of community providers are delaying the launch of new programs and services, and 81% of community providers are struggling to achieve quality standards. And again, each of these points is dependent solely on the workforce. That's the motivating factor, which highlighted their answer. So coming into the Case for Inclusion, we really knew that the workforce was going to drive most, if not all, of the metrics that we reported on. And you'll see that throughout the report that each of the points can be at least provided context about how the workforce has driven that number up or driven our quality measures down. The key findings were broken out into two parts. Part one is a highlight of the most significant trends that we saw. Part two is our recommendations about how we can build back a better infrastructure for home and community-based services. So in part one, our key findings were nationally, the average DSP turnover rate in 2020 increased by about 1 percentage point to 43.6%. I'd put that in context that while that may not seem significant to raise a single point, and while we may see singular providers and even singular states that have a much higher turnover rate, at some point when your turnover rate is so significant, you're closing that program. So we may see a plateau in that turnover rate in that high 50%, because at a certain point, those programs are just going to close rather than have their turnover rate increase more. Vacancy rates for full-time direct support positions increased from 8.5% in 2019 to 12.3% in 2020, which represented another huge jump and a roughly 45% increase. Again, this is significant, even if it feels like perhaps a low number or you've seen higher rates of vacancy, because at a certain point, people just close that service. As of 2018, 16 states in the District of Columbia had closed their last remaining large state-run institutions. 1 in 5, approximately 21.1% of people with IDD who receive employment or day supports were participating in an integrated employment service. And there were approximately 589,940 people on states' waiting lists for home and community-based services nationally. Again, this is looking at the most recent national numbers, which came from 2018. So we may have seen some changes in the last few years, but that's where we were in our last available national data. And nearly 4 in 5, approximately 78% of those waiting were concentrated in just 5 states. Again, these numbers are significant, not only because they show dramatic increases, but when we know the context of the workforce, these numbers have even greater meaning. So if we have a number of state-run institutions which have closed, that means there's all sorts of people who are now waiting for home and community-based services. And even though we have 589,000 approximately on states' waiting lists, that's accounting for numbers of people that are waiting to be authorized to seek services. But we know there's a whole secondary wait list of people who have been authorized for services, but can't find a provider available to meet their needs. So that brings us to our part 2 of the report, which focuses on solutions, our recommendations for the Biden administration, the 117th Congress, as well as states and provider advocates. Truly, a big focus is how do we incentivize federal funding to address the workforce crisis? That's built into all of our recommendations, incentivizing states to take it, appropriating funding to rebuild it and to build out the broader HCBS infrastructure. But in terms of other ways that we can address the workforce crisis, aside from the very obvious funneling additional funding into it, we also make recommendations that home and community-based services should be clearly included as part of the equal access rule, meaning that the federal government should be beholden to requiring states to provide adequate rates that create adequate access to services. This is something that's built into federal statute, but isn't often operationalized in regulation. Establishing a standard occupational classification, or a SOC, for direct support professionals through the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. So right now, there's not any specific classification to direct support professional, and that means when we're trying to track those data trends across the nation, like, for example, how much does a DSP receive in wage, we're really reliant on self-reporting, so we don't have a perfect national picture. But if we had a SOC, the Bureau of Labor would track all of those statistics. Looking at reimbursement rates every 3 years, requiring anyone who's receiving federal funding, or any state that's receiving federal funding, to review those reimbursement rates every 3 years. Those are just a few of the recommendations, but I would certainly ask everyone to read the report and see what you can do as a state or an advocate to support those potential solutions. I also wanted to highlight just very briefly that CMS put out a request for information on access that also gives us opportunities to better track the direct care workforce metrics and respond to them. And if anyone has any questions about that access RFI, I'm happy to answer them during the Q&A section. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Shane.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And Lydia, I must apologize. I think I might have called you by the wrong last name. I might have called you Lydia Brown. I have a colleague named Lydia Brown, and her name got stuck in my head. So my sincere apologies, Lydia Dawson.
No problem. I heard that, and I thought about saying beforehand, if anybody hasn't connected with Lydia Brown, she's an excellent self-advocate. She's written a number of incredible papers, and everyone should also look out for her.
Yeah, so my apologies for that. I'm trying to get past that mental block on my notes here. So thank you so much, Lydia, for offering that great context on the research that's been conducted. And now I'd like to invite Robert Espinoza to join the conversation. Robert, are you looking to see if you're still on the screen here?
I just started my video.
Okay.
But
we don't see. We don't see Robert highlighted. So if we could please spotlight Robert, and I'll read your introduction, Robert. Robert is the Executive Director of Policy at PHI, where he oversees its national advocacy, research, and public education division on the direct care workforce. In this role, he also contributes vision and leadership to PHI's organizational strategy, marketing and business development, and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Robert is a nationally recognized expert and frequent speaker on aging, long-term care, workforce, and equity issues. Thank you for joining us, Robert, and we'd like to invite you to offer your opening comments.
Thank you, Shane, and thank you, Lydia, for setting the stage for today's conversation. Thank you also for inviting me and for including PHI's analysis in today's talk. Just for descriptive purposes, I am a 45-year-old Latino male. I have a salt and pepper beard, a blue-gray plaid dress shirt. My pronouns are he and him, and my background is a blurred visual of my home office. So I just want to share a few thoughts this afternoon about the direct care workforce and kind of the critical challenges and the realities that they're facing today, just to help, I think, frame the conversation and put forward some of the ideas that I think PHI puts out. For those of you who are not familiar with PHI, we are a national organization that's focused on strengthening the country's direct care workforce. And we do that in three ways. We produce research and analysis on these workers and the role they play in today's long-term services and support system. We also advocate for federal, state and local policy reforms. And we design a range of workforce interventions where we work closely with employers like home care agencies or nursing homes to design workforce development programs and other kinds of approaches like training, advancement opportunities, and so much more to really strengthen and optimize this workforce. Just for, again, for level setting, we define direct care workers as home care workers, residential care aides, and nursing assistants who support older adults and people with disabilities in a variety of long-term care settings. They work in people's private homes, they work in nursing homes, and they work in a vast range of residential care settings. Direct support professionals are a segment of the home care workforce who support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I want to share just a few thoughts this afternoon about this workforce. The first is that when we look at the demographic data on these workers, we are seeing a very diverse workforce. The vast majority of direct care workers are women. The majority are people of color, and about 1 in 4 direct care workers is an immigrant. Because our research captures data through the formal long-term care market and not the gray market, where many consumers are often out of financial necessity, often hire workers off the book, so to speak. Our research doesn't capture undocumented immigrants or people who are not going through the formal system. So where we can imagine there are even larger percentages of immigrants. Our research also shows that about 1 in 4 direct care workers are aged 55 and older. So in many instances in today's long-term care system, it is older workers supporting other older workers. And I reference this not just because it's important for us to think about diversity and how to welcome and embrace diversity in the sector, but also because oftentimes these workers are also facing unique additional challenges that are complicating their ability to succeed on the job and also in their lives. Take, for example, immigrants who might be at the same time as working a pretty challenging job, navigating a complex and sometimes hostile immigration system. And there are many examples across these demographics that I think could really fill out that point. The second point that I want to make is that when you look at the median wage for direct care workers, the median wage is about $13 an hour. Adjusted for inflation, that's a wage that has only increased by about 20 to 30 cents over the last 10 years. So it's a wage that has remained persistently low. And because many workers are relegated to part-time schedules, either by the economy or their employer, about half live in or near poverty. This is one of the main drivers for high turnover that we often see in this sector. It also means that median wages are not just not livable, they're also not competitive. And so in many parts of the country, we see long-term care employers and consumers struggling to compete with industries like fast food or retail for the same job candidates. The third point I want to make is that the focus, we believe, in strengthening this workforce in many ways should be about improving overall job quality, not just compensation, but also the training opportunities and the training requirements that frame this workforce, and also advancement opportunities so that workers know it's an opportunity where they can advance in their careers and they can see kind of new opportunities where they can play a bigger role in care delivery, but also increased compensation and elevated titles. We often see that training requirements for these workers are simply inadequate, and the training programs, whether in person or virtual, are simply not up to the standards that training programs should have, especially when we're talking about supporting adult learners or people with different learning styles. Data collection on this workforce is also not strong, especially at the state level, and especially when looking at variables like turnover rates or vacancy rates as two examples. And that's knowing more about this workforce and those two variables will help us better understand what kinds of shortages we're seeing at the local and regional level in particular. The final few points I'll make in my last minute or so is that we do see improving financing in this country as a big part of improving jobs in direct care. One, because at least in the public market, Medicaid is the primary long-term payer of long-term care and of these jobs. Yet we often find is that the system is underfunded, and too often providers are receiving inadequate reimbursement rates. And so if we really want to improve these jobs, we should be thinking about bolstering that financing system. Another is we should be thinking about how to standardize and professionalize this workforce. We know at core that the work that direct care workers do is professional, yet it has not been professionalized. And oftentimes these jobs are not portable, either across settings within a state or across states, which really limits the versatility of this workforce. We should also think about new types of workers who could fill these jobs. Immigrants are a great example. We know that there are millions of undocumented immigrants that could form a labor pool, but also we could recruit immigrants from other countries. We could also think about men in direct care, since men are underrepresented in this sector. And of course, how do we shift the public narrative? How do we raise more awareness and support for this workforce and for LTSS more broadly? And how do we stop stigmatizing these jobs and these workers and create something that's more strength-based and possibility-based, because that's a big part of the extent to which public and policy leaders actually support this job sector. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and I look forward to the conversation that follows.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's excellent research and very, very enlightening comments. Thank you so much for your contributions. Next, I'd like to turn to Colleen Crispino. Colleen is president and CEO of UCP of Long Island. She has a record of strong leadership skills, including program development, strategic planning, corporate communications, team building, and staff development. She's a seasoned advocate with an extensive history of working collaboratively with elected government officials. In her previous role, Crispino was the Chief Program Officer for the Viscardi Center on Long Island. And I'm very jealous because you got to work with John Kemp while you were there, I assume. And he's a personal hero of mine. She has also worked as an adjunct faculty professor for Hofstra University. So Colleen, I'd like to invite you to offer your comments.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. As means of introduction, I am a white female. I have short curly blonde hair. I wear glasses. I'm wearing a gray sweater and a floral purple and white top. And my background is my office here at UCP of Long Island. I'm going to try to share my screen. I have two screens, so I'm hopeful this is going to work. Did it work? Can you see it? So I'm going to reference back to some of the things that Lydia mentioned during her presentation and kind of tie them into our experience as a provider here on Long Island. The first thing I want to say is that direct service professionals are really the foundation of our field. You know, they provide intimate personal care, they help support people in jobs, they give out medications, they do this very vast array of very professional things that don't always get recognized. If we have any of them with us during this session, I want to say thank you on behalf of our organization, but probably all the organizations that have DSPs. So what's the problem? The workforce crisis, as Lydia said, increased, the vacancy rates for direct service professionals increased by 45% just in that 1 year period. Here on Long Island, we are seeing 20% and upwards as vacancy rates, in large part because New York's a very rich state in terms of services for people with disabilities. So we have more services to offer, which means we require more staff to do, to provide them. as a means of context for us, I have 20% less employees now than I had 5 years ago. The sheer number of employees I have has dropped by that amount just in this short period of time, which I think is really significant when you're looking at, we're still providing much of the same services, not all of them, but much of them, and we're doing that with less people. And what are the causes? So it's decades of underinvestment. And that doesn't mean that we haven't seen increases, but they have not kept pace with the trends, that we need to see in order to continue to provide services at the level that we would like to be providing services. The pandemic was a major factor in exacerbating a crisis that already existed. Childcare issues for families, illness, the fear of illness, all took people out of our field and didn't allow them to return to us. The rising minimum wage has been a real issue. And I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but we've always been proud of being able to pay above minimum wage and having our direct support professionals feel like they're making more than they would make at Target or at Walmart or at the grocery store. And as minimum wages have gone up around the country, and specifically here in our area on Long Island, our rates have not kept up with what minimum wage has been able to do. So we are now close to, at, or slightly above minimum wage across most of the island. And it's been more challenging work. A lot of the individuals we support in long-term support services are aging. They require a lot more physical assistance. Our workforce is aging. I don't know that that's been mentioned yet, but when I look at our workforce, a lot of them have been with us for a long time, which is great. But as they age, they become less physically able to provide real intense physical care. So those things are a factor. And again, some of these things Lydia mentioned, but I'll tie them back to UCP. People are turning away new referrals. We're delaying the launch of programs. Here at UCP, my day programs are operating at 50% of their capacity since COVID shut us down. And we cannot go back because we do not have enough direct service professionals in day programs, and we don't have transportation, which is bus drivers and matrons and other people that provide that level of support. Our respite programs are suspended. Our employment services have been shrinking, and we're using more temporary staff, which is great for safety, but not great for quality necessarily. And there's a quote in the case for inclusion that says, when providers lack an adequate number of qualified DSPs, they're forced to prioritize the basic essential needs of people over other activities. So we're maintaining safety and doing those things that are really critical, but at the expense of recreation in the community, socialization, and other employment and other activities. What's the impact on service recipients? They get less service or no service in some instances, definitely less individualized services. They have less access to the community. And I really believe they're suffering from higher unemployment than prior to the COVID pandemic. We have an individual who's a 12-year work history, lost his job due to COVID, not enough staff to work with him to ensure that he gets himself back into the workforce. So these are all critical issues for all of us that are dedicated to working in the field. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to try and stop sharing. And I think some of the solutions for us is we need to focus on attracting new employees, much like one of my fellow panelists said. We have to look at immigrant groups, men, anyone else who doesn't traditionally look at this as a professional, worthwhile field. And we have to have resources, whether they come federally or from states. We have to ensure that we have enough dollars to pay people what they deserve to make, so that we ensure that all these systems of services that we've developed don't fall by the wayside and we don't go backwards instead of forward. So that is, kind of how I see the situation, and hopefully, we'll all be part of the solutions to make this better as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Appreciate your initial comments and looking forward to questions that we might receive from the audience and some of your responses to those as well. I'd now like to introduce our final panelists, Dr. Brandis Pearson. Dr. Pearson is a healthcare leader, educator, mentor, and motivational speaker for youth, women, entrepreneurs, and individuals. Dr. Pearson received her education doctorate in executive leadership from St. John Fisher College. Her overall goals are to help people remove self-limiting barriers in order to become the best version of themselves and to create pathways to equity and inclusion at the organizational level. She is the proud mom of two extraordinary young men, Sean and Brandon. Dr. Pearson, please offer your opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane, and thank you to UCP for having me on this panel. I'm going to share my screen. I just like the previous presenter, I have two screens here, so hopefully that doesn't interfere. So Colleen, thank you for leading the way on that. I am a 40-year-old Black female with Black shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a multicolored top, and my background is a blurred view of my workspace. So we're talking about the DSPs of color and that crisis that we're in. So I'm just going to present on ways of coping that I've learned through my research, recommendations for organizations, and recommendations for individuals who are working as direct support professionals. So what's the issue? I'm going to just share some highlights from previous presenters to recap. DSPs are predominantly individuals from marginalized populations, with nearly 60% of DSPs being people of color, mainly Black or Latino, and the great majority of those being women. There's a lack of critical mass. That's why it matters in those positions of leadership, because that can translate to microaggressions, lack of representation, and policies and procedures that don't consider the voices of the people on the front line. There's a mantra, nothing about us without us. DSPs are on the front line. That's an issue that was highlighted during COVID. These are high-risk jobs, risk of exposure to communicable diseases, abuse, and communities with varied levels of safety and security. And that DSP salary, 45% or somewhere below, just near 50% of the nation's DSPs are living near the poverty line. So there's a difference between thriving and surviving when you are not making a living wage. So when faced with the barriers and stressors that we discussed, we're talking about the participants who were engaged in my research and the ways that they have been able to navigate and cope with those stressors. There were themes that bubbled up during my research, and they fell into the 4 buckets of self, situation, support, and strategies. Under the theme of self, the responses of those responses fell into 3 buckets: self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-efficacy. For self-awareness and self-regulation, there was some overlap. Participants described an unspoken mandate to consciously monitor their appearance, facial expression, and communication with colleagues, a routine that the participants felt attributed directly to being a person of color. That performance of self-regulation was described as exhausting and metaphorically like wearing a mask. There was a quote, "I can't let them see me sweat. I can't let them see my vulnerabilities." Self-efficacy arose when talking about why they remain in their role, even with those stressors and barriers. And it was their level of self-awareness that allowed them to see the value that they added to the spaces that they entered and the roles that they occupied. For situation, when speaking about the dynamics that influence the health and wellness in work environments, imbalance was a common theme. Imbalance speaks to the idea that your body and your mind are constantly under stress related to either work or everyday microaggressions or other racial events or just overall trauma, and your body never really gets a chance to stabilize and to really get to a state of rest. So with that work-life balance and COVID making those home and our work environments overlap, and then system navigation. The participants spoke of structural hierarchies, gossip, and work politics. They also felt strongly that they had to justify asking for what they need, asking for promotions, or asking for support to complete tasks in ways that their colleagues from other racial groups did not seem to have to. There was a quote that a participant shared: "I've literally had to navigate when to speak up, how to speak up, and who to speak to." Under support, that was referring to the ways that participants described their support networks. One theme came up: a circle of trust. So participants expressed a desire to establish a circle of trust, allowing them to foster a community of support as direct support professionals. And finally, under strategies, employed strategies to employ well-being, to ensure well-being. Strength, that was one theme. The participants were asked to identify their strategies to address their well-being. Overwhelmingly, they identified inner strength as the way of coping. And although strength is associated with some positive implications, ultimately strength was viewed as a prison. And finally, sacrifice. Participants were asked, if anything, what have you had to sacrifice in pursuit of your career? The responses included self, health, time, family, and peace. So what can orgs do? Recommendations for employers: dismantle inequitable systems and organizational structures. That means be transparent in hiring practices and succession planning. Create safe spaces. Allow appropriate space for colleagues to engage and network without judgment, which can lead to much needed mentoring relationships. And incorporate culturally inclusive activities. Survey your staff, do your research, and diversify your offerings. And for individuals, recommendations for direct support professionals to ensure health, wellness, and well-being: prioritize self-care, whatever that looks like for you. Establish a network of like-minded individuals. They don't all have to look like you, but make sure that they are an ally, which can lead to a mentoring relationship with someone who is culturally competent and familiar with your work. Become more self-aware. It will be much more difficult to navigate your role if you aren't aware of how you show up. And finally, establish a healthy work-life balance. Structure and prioritize your tasks. Don't take on too much, and don't fall into the self-sacrificing and self-deprecating cycle of being superheroes. But we know you are. So thank you, that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Brandis, for sharing that with us. And I think this has just been a wonderful sort of arc in the presentation so far, going from a very macro sort of national research base, bringing it all the way down to at a personal level and from an identity standpoint. So thank you so much for all of the panelists so far. I'd like to invite all the panelists to come back on camera. And we are now going to go to the Q&A portion of the session. So I would like to invite the audience, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function within the Zoom toolbar that you have. And as we look for those questions to come in, we have no open questions at the moment. So I have a few questions prepared for our panelists. So I can start with that as we have the audience share their questions as well. So this first question is for Lydia and for Robert. From, in terms of your research and from a macro perspective, and something that I'm very uniquely interested in, the role of technology in the delivery of human service and how that relates to direct support professionals and the workforce that we've been talking about. What do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities based on our experience over the past several years and where this profession might be going? And please, either of you, in terms of who would like to go first.
Sure. So technology is a really interesting, has an interesting cross-section with the direct support professional workforce. A lot of times when we think about technology and the advancements that we've seen and the flexibilities we've seen through the public health emergency, we're thinking about how to provide supports to people in their homes without necessarily having to be in physical close contact. And it really opened up a world of remote supports that we hadn't necessarily ventured into before the public health emergency, out of necessity for people who didn't want to have that close contact with other people. And so in many ways, having that immediate flexibility, the ability to use iPhones and use the internet and use video conferencing to replace what we had been doing with direct support professionals in a person's home, opened up a new way to access supports without necessarily needing a person. But at the same time, it shouldn't be viewed as a replacement. It should be viewed as another tool. There's a lot of individuals who can benefit with just a little bit of support or a little bit of checking in that can be accomplished virtually. But that option to be able to have someone in your home being there physically to support you as a preference, as well as something as a necessity, shouldn't be viewed as a binary system where you have one or the other.
Yeah, I would really agree with Lydia on those points and underscore just the reality that for us, what we see is often direct care workers are doing the type of work that really needs to happen in person. It's very hands-on. And to imagine that technology will replace direct care workers doesn't really, I don't think is logical, just given the context of what they're doing. So thinking about technology as something that can support workers and maybe ease the lift on the job, for example, maybe technology that can better assist lifting somebody, for example, or we see a lot of technology solutions that are about helping consumers find workers that are applicable based on their preferences and their needs and their availability. 2 cautionary points that I would make about technology. One is that too often we see that technology hasn't been properly vetted or evaluated at least in terms of doing no harm, but also to support the kind of claims that a lot of tech investors and tech companies are making about the possibility of their technology products. And we know it's a big market and there's opportunity and so on, but we also need to make sure that they're being properly tested and vetted before they're brought to scale and before they're regulated and approved by government, so to speak. The other point is that we have seen a lot of possibilities with technology when it comes to supporting workers in the field. So we know of demonstration projects where, when workers are equipped with smartphones and training and just easier access with members of the care team and consumers and others, that it helps them better identify, better observe, record, and report the kind of changes in client conditions that when they are reported in early enough can really make a difference in terms of optimizing someone's health. And so we see technology as a key piece of, I would say, interventions that have already been tested and proven to really have an impact on people's health.
Thank you so much, Lydia and Robert. Excellent answers. Colleen and Brandis, did you have any thoughts on that particular question before we move on to the next? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So we have a few things coming in the Q&A box. So I will start at the top here. We did have a question about whether there's any data we can find on the employment rate for people with speech difficulties and who use augmentative and alternative communication systems. So I was wondering if anyone on the panel, is that something that you might be familiar with, or is that maybe something we refer that individual back to James for some additional support? Looks like all signs point to James, so we can follow up with them. Yeah. Next question from Toby Patrick. Are there websites for DSP agencies to access to learn coping strategies on education, or tools? So any good websites for DSP agencies to be aware of in terms of references or resources? Any thoughts?
So I just have a thought about that. One of the things that bubbled up in the research, and of course I only shared a very small bit of that, but to have offerings for employees. Of course we have EAP, but subscription opportunities to Virgin Pulse, which is an app that you can use to access different coping skills and tools. Also Headspace. We've had some agencies who have subscribed to Headspace, and they're able to provide some tools for coping and things of that nature. So there are resources out there that may not be specific to DSPs, but broad enough to help people from all industries.
Thank you, Brandis. Any other, Lydia, Robert, or Colleen, other websites that you would point people to? I think, Robert, you put something in the chat as well.
Yes, and I'm sure several people are familiar with the National Association of Direct Support Professionals. Their website has quite a bit of resources, including for workers and I imagine agencies as well. That said, I think it's a good starting point.
Okay, great, thank you. I do have a few questions in the chat for Colleen. Did the federal COVID funding help with DSP workers? And is there any chance that will continue into the future?
Well, yes, I'm going to say it's helping us retain workers. So in New York State, they opted to use that money to incentivize our existing staff. So they did a two-phase kind of bonus payment, or we're in the process of doing it now. So if you were here during 2021, and if you stayed with us through 21 into early 2022, you're eligible for two separate very significant bonus payments, which have definitely helped with our retention because people know they have to be here on the day that those are given. So that's helped us retain our workforce. I don't know that it's necessarily helping us recruit, and they are time limited. So, once they're done and over, that the appeal of that won't last very long. In our state budget, however, for this next year, and they're promising 2 years, we are looking at being able to offer incentives for every 6 months you work. You can earn an extra $1,500 at least twice during that period as sort of a sign-on bonus, recruitment, retention. So we think that that will help. It hasn't started yet, but we think that that will help us going forward. But these are very short-term measures without actually changing the funding and allowing us to just professionalize the overall salaries and just move the whole range up.
Great, thank you, Colleen. A related question, and this is open to the panel. Kristen put in a question around upward mobility for DSPs. So apart from pay raises, apart from the economics of that, what would upward mobility look like in the profession? And maybe, Robert, this goes back to some of the points you were making around professionalization within the field.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, when we think about advancement, we think of advancement in a few ways. One is within direct care. There are a number of positions that employers can create and that public and private investors can support that would really make a difference in terms of both improving services and supports for clients and residents, but also kind of maximizing the job and providing a real advancement career opportunity for workers. They include things like dementia specialists, people who support people with dementia, or transition specialists, the worker who might be able to help someone transition from a hospital to a private home or to a residential setting. The other way to think about advancement is also beyond direct care into, say, management and executive positions within long-term care, or into other healthcare settings, like as nurses, as one example, right? Typically, those kind of advancement opportunities require some type of partnership with community colleges and universities that can really kind of bridge the gap in knowledge and understanding about what it means to advance in that way. But it is an opportunity for workers who actually want to go far and beyond that.
If I may, Shane.
Please.
Thank you. Sorry, just again to speak to that, I think mentorship is paramount. I think we have to really help people find mentors and people who understand their work and understand the scope of practice. And that can happen through that networking and building those circles of trust and creating those safe spaces for people to convene and meet and network. And then transparency in hiring practices and succession planning. I mean, turnover and attrition are real. And so if we have people in place that can really plan for that next move and hire within the organization, and I know sometimes that's a fuzzy and a gray subject where people want opportunities from outside of organizations. But if you have colleagues who are homegrown and they're dedicated to your organization, I think it just makes sense, and it builds that rapport and that retention to have people work on their workforce trajectory and their development and their career trajectory within their organization, especially if they are if they're grounded in that and rooted in your organization. Sorry,
Thank you,
I
Brandis.
was a loss for words.
No, that's fine. Often. Thank you. Lydia, I think you would often.
Sure. I just wanted to add, I know that you mentioned ways to address it outside of funding, and this is a little bit funding related, because if we're unable to pay a livable wage, that's so indicative of how we value the workforce and value the professionalism of what they're doing. But I would, just as a separate note, again, come back to the concept of a SOC. If you look at your state's reimbursement rate methodology, so how the state funds what how the service operates, there should be a line that's related to the wage of the direct support professional. And usually that wage is derived from the SOC, the Bureau of Labor Statistic, that they're saying this is what this profession is most like. And because we don't have a SOC for a direct support professional, you can see what the state thinks that the direct support professional is most like of the available statistics. Depending on how it works out, it's either they either just use a singular statistic, but they'll also look at blended statistics. So you can see, are they considering our direct support professional within our state to be more like a certified nursing assistant, or are they looking like it to be more like a camp counselor, or are they doing a blend where they're saying they're 10% a personal health aide and they're 20% a personal trainer. So you can really see those breaking that out, how the state professionalizes the direct support professional based on how they're choosing to reimburse it. So it's not just about the funding, but about how is the state regarding the work that the direct support professional is actually doing in the field.
Thank you, Lydia. Colleen, any thoughts from your perspective, especially being on the front line of trying to hire and retain?
Yeah, and I think my fellow panelists covered a lot of the important parts, but I do think that all organizations could probably do a better job in identifying these career paths, really encouraging staff. I think mentorship is a great thought, because there are other, there's training. What about human resources? You have somebody who, has a skill. Where are we encouraging them? And, nursing was a great example. I had new employee orientation yesterday, and I had someone who was a DSP for us for years, and she left us and just came back, and now she's an LPN. So it was great to see her return to us, as a nurse now, as opposed to a DSP. And I think if you even look at lots of the CEOs in the field, including me, my first job in the field, I was a DSP. So I think we have to talk about those things, and we have to say none of this is impossible. And I've done it, and other people can do it, and we have to walk them through it. So I think thinking about how to support people through that process so that they know the right direction to go in, I think would go a long way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I have one final question, at least in the chat so far. And this is actually, I'm going to build off of some of our prepared questions as well. And really anyone can answer, but I think this was directed, at least in my chat, towards Robert and Brandis. What are the unique challenges faced by DSPs of color when compared to those who are not from communities of color as part of the overall workforce? And also please comment on advocacy strategies as well.
Sure. So I'll take a first stab at it. Earlier this year, we actually did research on racial and gender disparities within the direct care workforce. And what our data showed was that people of color, in terms of like different populations, had higher poverty rates and lower median family incomes than their white and male counterparts within direct care, which showed us was something we suspected, which is that in a workforce that was already marginalized, it's women, people of color, and immigrants who fare worse than their counterparts. And I think that speaks to kind of just the overarching challenge that many of these demographics are facing. Just to speak more specifically to some of those points, I mean, I think that, we see a few dynamics when it comes to immigrants in the direct care workforce, we see that they're often navigating a variety of life challenges. A lot of times are their legal challenges, their increased hostility. Immigrants rely often in their networks and communities for the kind of supports that many of us take for granted, I think, who are not immigrants. And what we see is that when the country becomes more hostile and makes it more difficult to live in this country, those support systems become smaller and they become kind of less strong for many workers. And so what we've seen is kind of more challenges at a time in which immigrants are clearly both a big part of both the current and the reality, the current and the future of this workforce. Other issues that we see are issues around cultural and linguistic competence. So oftentimes the workforce development programs that are aimed generally at low-wage workers or direct care workers, more specifically, are not necessarily tested and designed in such a way that they're applicable to people from different cultures, different language capacities, and so on. So I think that's another challenge that we see within direct care.
Yeah, like Robert, of course, spot on, right? Like you're talking about facts, and I think that's where we should be. And then there's that intersectionality of race, gender, and ability. I think sometimes we forget that there's this kind of hidden cohort of DSPs who are also navigating supports themselves, right? Like so that intersection of adding a level of ability is something that I think is something that our DSPs navigate. I am a mom of an extraordinary child who has Down syndrome, and I've been a DSP myself outside of being his caregiver. And just the things that I've seen anecdotally and things that I've experienced, I think it's something that it's hard to even articulate. Those microaggressions, it's hard to express really what a microaggression feels like, because the intention is not always malice. And so, you know, kind of holding on and carrying that weight of someone's misguided comments is really, really heavy, and it's a burden that you have to bear. And I think just creating those, again, I can't say this enough, creating safe spaces for people to come and say, this happened to me, and not have that pushed to the side, and actually have people who listen and who are culturally competent, like Robert said, I think is so, so important to really, you don't always have to agree with what someone says, but just to say, I hear you, and that was your lived experience, but not dismiss it as false. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. With that, we're going to go ahead and close this session. I'd like to thank all of the panelists. I have found this incredibly informative, and it has truly been an honor to listen to all of you and learn from all of you. So I would definitely encourage the audience that joined us today, but also those who are able to access this presentation after today, to take this information and really incorporate it into your thought process, into your program development. And I would very much encourage people to reach out to you, our panel, and your organizations to find opportunities to work together. I certainly see a need for an action around recognition of this profession within the labor market, the professionalization that goes along with that, and also very intentionally ensuring that we are being inclusive and who is welcomed into that profession. And I think there's so much work that could be done in that area. And I would personally enjoy being a part of that and helping to contribute to that in any way along with your organizations. So I'm definitely taking an action. I hope everyone else will as well. So I'd like to turn it over to Armando at this point to help close out today's event. Thank you all.
Thank you, Shane, for joining us today and to lead such an important discussion. And as a board member of Source America, my sincere appreciation for all that you do for this great organization. I want to extend my gratitude to the ANCOR Foundation for the partnership of the publication of the Case for Inclusion report. A special note here that there's a section in this report titled "Why It Matters That Most of the Nation's Disability Support Professionals Are Women of Color" by James Garcia. It highlights that 80% are women, 2/3 are women of color, and the biggest growth proportionally is among Latinas, and immigrants from around the world. Again, you can view or download the report at ucp.org or at caseforinclusion.org. A major thank you to our moderators, panelists for their insight and expertise on the important topics shared today. And also, James, thank you for emceeing today as well. And again, our deepest appreciation to our premier sponsor, Waymo. Thank you, Amanda Zink Ventura, for the generosity of Waymo. We want to thank CARF International and Greystone Consulting for their generosity. And to our great friend and honorary Board of Trustees member, RJ Mitty, our sincere gratitude for accepting our invitation to be our keynoter today and for sharing his inspiring story. And last, and really importantly, please visit ucp.org to access information on the vital and quality services that our UCP affiliates provide across the country and in Canada. And please donate directly to their mission. And you can find all of this information on our site. So that concludes our conference today. We'll be back tomorrow at noon Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific for the second day of our virtual conference. For full conference details, please visit our website at ucp.org and check under the events tab to find our conference webpage. I look forward to seeing all of you back here tomorrow for the second half of the UCP 2022 annual conference. Have a great day and thank you so much. Bye-bye.